In October 1981, workers outside Britain's most secretive military science complex found something that should not have been there. A bucket of soil. It had been left near the perimeter of Porton Down, the government research site in Wiltshire associated for decades with chemical and biological warfare. There was a message with it. The people who delivered the soil claimed it had come from a tiny Scottish island more than 500 miles away. They called themselves the Dark Harvest Commandos. Their warning was simple. Clean the island, or we will bring the island to you. The soil was sent for testing. It contained anthrax. Not a harmless relative. Not a rumor. Not an environmental false alarm. The sample carried the same biological signature linked to a secret British weapons experiment from the Second World War. For nearly 40 years, the government had kept the island closed. Warning signs faced the sea. Local fishermen avoided its beaches. Maps and official language treated it as a restricted place. The war had ended in 1945, but the island remained dangerous enough that the public was told not to land there. Now someone had gone ashore. Someone had dug into the contaminated earth. Someone had carried part of Britain's forgotten weapon across the country and placed it outside the laboratory where the story had begun. And that was only the first delivery. Days later, another container appeared near Blackpool, where the Conservative Party was holding its annual conference under Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher. The second sample was not contaminated, but the message was unmistakable. The island secret could travel. The government's old experiment could become a modern threat. Who were the Dark Harvest Commandos? How had they reached the island? Why had the British government deliberately poisoned part of Scotland? And what kind of weapon leaves land dangerous for nearly half a century after the war it was designed for has ended? The answer begins in 1942, when Britain was preparing for a form of war so terrible that even Nazi Germany never forced it to use. The weapon was not meant to destroy a factory. It was not meant to sink a battleship. It was designed to fall quietly into German fields. 5 million small cattle cakes. 5 million pieces of animal feed. 5 million invisible doses of catastrophe. The plan was called Operation Vegetarian. And if Britain had used it, the first victims would have been cows. The final victims might have numbered in the millions. But before British scientists could decide whether the weapon would work, they needed somewhere to test it. They chose an island. A green island. A beautiful island. An island close enough to Scotland to be reached by boat, but isolated enough that the government believed no one would notice what happened there. Its name was Gruinard. It would soon be known by another name. Anthrax Island. Before we go further, keep one question in mind. How does a government test a weapon it cannot safely clean up? Because that is the question Britain failed to answer before the first bomb was detonated. Gruinard Island lies just off the northwest coast of Scotland, across a narrow stretch of water from the rugged landscape of Wester Ross. From the mainland, it does not look like the setting for one of the darkest experiments in British military history. It looks quiet. Treeless in places. Green. Windblown. Surrounded by cold water and distant mountains. That appearance was part of its usefulness. In wartime planning, remoteness can look like permission. The island had no permanent population during the trials. It could be watched from the mainland. Boats could be kept away. The military could transport animals and equipment there under secrecy. If the experiment went wrong, officials believed the sea would contain the danger. That last assumption would prove disastrously optimistic. Britain had entered the Second World War fearing that Germany might use biological weapons. Intelligence about enemy capabilities was uncertain. Memories of poison gas from the First World War still shaped military thinking. The possibility that cities, crops, animals, or water supplies could be attacked with disease was treated seriously. Governments on several sides explored weapons that could kill invisibly and continue spreading after impact. Britain's biological warfare work was centered at Porton Down. Porton had already existed as a military research site since the First World War, when chemical warfare transformed the battlefield. By the 1940s, scientists there were investigating pathogens as possible weapons and as threats Britain might need to defend against. One of the central figures was Paul Fields. Fields was a bacteriologist and medical researcher who became head of the Biological Warfare Department at Porton. He was intelligent, driven, and willing to work inside the moral darkness of total war. To men like Fields, the question was not whether biological weapons were horrifying. Everyone understood they were horrifying. The question was whether Britain could afford to let Germany develop them first. That distinction mattered enormously. A weapon framed as retaliation can be prepared more easily than a weapon framed as aggression. Officials could tell themselves they were building a deterrent. If Hitler used biological warfare, Britain would need the ability to respond. If the enemy knew Britain could retaliate, perhaps the weapon would never be used. But deterrent requires credibility. Credibility requires preparation. Preparation requires testing. And testing a weapon based on a living organism creates a problem explosives do not. A bomb stops exploding. A spore can remain. That was the danger waiting on Gruinard. The biological agent chosen for the experiments was anthrax. Anthrax is caused by the bacterium Bacillus anthracis. It most commonly affects grazing animals, whose contact with contaminated soil can expose them to spores. Those spores are exceptionally persistent. Under the right conditions, they can survive in soil for years or even decades. That persistence made anthrax attractive to weapons planners. It also made it almost impossible to control once released. The British scientists wanted to know whether an anthrax weapon could kill livestock effectively. If it could, then the disease might be used against Germany's agricultural system. The result would not simply be dead cattle. It could contaminate land, disrupt meat and dairy supplies, create panic, force massive animal slaughter, overwhelm veterinary systems, and expose humans through infected animals or products. The weapon's power was not only mortality. It was duration. A conventional bomb destroys one place at one moment. Anthrax could make a place dangerous after the aircraft had returned home, after the soldiers had moved on, after the front line had changed, and after the government that ordered the attack claimed victory. This is why Gruinard's story matters. The experiment did not end when the sheep died. The island became the experiment. In 1942, the military transported sheep to Gruinard. The animals were tethered at measured distances from a test device. Cameras recorded the event. Scientists and soldiers wore protective clothing and respirators by the standards of the time. The island was turned into a controlled killing field, though control was the one thing the experiment would ultimately fail to demonstrate. An explosive device dispersed anthrax spores into the air near the animals. At first, the island looked unchanged. The grass remained green. The sea continued moving. The sheep stood where they had been placed. Then they became ill. Within days, the exposed animals died. From the narrow perspective of weapons research, the test was a success. The agent worked. From every other perspective, the result was a warning. The carcasses were contaminated. The soil was contaminated. The equipment, clothing, and surrounding area had to be handled carefully. Some of the dead sheep were buried beneath rock and earth. The island was restricted. And then the contamination escaped the neat boundaries of the test. Local animals on the mainland reportedly died in incidents associated with infected material reaching the coast. One explanation held that a sheep carcass buried on Gruinard had been disturbed by a storm, washed into the sea, and carried contamination toward the mainland. Whether every local story was understood correctly at the time mattered less than the fear. People living near Gruinard saw animals die. They heard rumors. They saw officials. They watched an island become forbidden. The experiment had been secret, but the consequences were visible enough to create a local mythology. Hereabouts, people began calling it the Island of Death. And the government had a new problem. The weapon worked too well. Why would Britain prepare such a weapon? To answer that, the story has to move away from the Scottish coast and into the logic of total war. By 1942, Britain had survived the Battle of Britain, but the outcome of the war remained uncertain. German forces dominated much of Europe. The Soviet Union was under immense pressure. Britain faced U-boat attacks, bombing, shortages, and the possibility that Germany might introduce new weapons. Military planners considered options that would have been unthinkable in peacetime. Total war transforms morality by changing the scale of fear. If the enemy might destroy your cities, starve your people, or use disease first, almost any retaliatory plan can be described as necessary. Operation Vegetarian emerged from that atmosphere. The plan was not to drop anthrax directly on German cities. It was more indirect, more deceptive, and perhaps more devastating. British aircraft would scatter contaminated cattle feed over grazing areas in Germany. The cakes would look like ordinary animal food. Cattle would eat them. The animals would die. The disease could spread through herds, soil, carcasses, processing systems, and human contact. Germany's food supply would be attacked through the bodies of its livestock. The plan's name was almost grotesquely mild: Operation Vegetarian. A harmless-sounding phrase for a biological strike intended to destroy meat production and create mass suffering. That contrast is one reason the story is so memorable. The name sounds like a diet. The plan was famine. The plan required millions of cakes. Not prototypes. Not a few test pieces. Millions. Files ordered roughly 5 million pieces of cattle feed to be prepared. The work involved civilian companies and workers who were not always told the full purpose of what they were making. The finished pieces had to be packaged, transported, and stored without spreading contamination before deployment. The details of manufacture belonged to a secret production system. But the scale reveals how serious the plan became. 5 million is not a laboratory experiment. 5 million is operational preparation. That number tells us Britain was not merely asking whether such an attack was theoretically possible. It was creating the material needed to carry it out if the order came. And that raises the central question: how close did Britain come to using it? The answer is more disturbing than a simple yes or no. Operation Vegetarian was not waiting on one scientist's desk as a fantasy. The cakes were made. Packaging was arranged. Aircraft delivery was studied. The plan was timed for a season when German cattle would be grazing in the open and more likely to consume feed scattered across fields. The weapon had moved beyond imagination and into logistics. That is when a plan becomes dangerous. A government can debate a weapon for years. Committees can discuss ethics, feasibility, retaliation, and military value. But when factories are producing components, workers are handling secret materials, aircraft are being considered, and millions of pieces are stored, the distance between proposal and use begins to shrink. Some of the labor was performed by women whose ordinary industrial skills were absorbed into the hidden machinery of biological warfare. They worked under secrecy, carrying out repetitive tasks without necessarily seeing the entire strategic picture. This was common in wartime Britain. Civilian factories, laboratories, farms, and workshops became parts of a national war machine. A worker might make one component without knowing the final weapon. Compartmentalization protected secrets and protected consciences. Operation Vegetarian depended on that compartmentalization. One company produced the feed material. Another cut it into pieces. Government laboratories supplied the contamination. Workers prepared the final stock. Military planners considered delivery. Each step could be described as technical. Only when the steps are placed together does the horror become visible. This is how states build weapons that no single person feels fully responsible for. One person orders. One person designs. One person tests. One person packages. One person flies. Responsibility is divided until catastrophe becomes a process. The cakes were intended for cattle, but the target was Germany's civilian society. Destroying livestock on a massive scale could create food shortages and panic. Contaminated animals could expose farmers, butchers, transport workers, veterinarians, soldiers, and families. Rural areas might remain dangerous long after the attack. The damage could continue after peace negotiations, after surrender, and after the collapse of the Nazi regime. This is what makes biological warfare different from many other weapons. It does not respect the moment when politics changes. A government can fall. A spore does not know. The official justification for Britain's biological warfare program was often tied to retaliation. If Germany used biological weapons, Britain needed the ability to respond. That argument gave the program moral cover. It placed responsibility for first use on Hitler. But wartime planning rarely remains morally neat. As the conflict intensified, British leaders discussed increasingly destructive options. Area bombing already targeted cities on a vast scale. Blockade and economic warfare affected civilian populations. Firestorms killed tens of thousands. The line between military target and civilian society had already been badly damaged. Would Operation Vegetarian have been used only after a German biological attack? Or might military desperation have changed the threshold? Historians have debated how advanced the policy was and under what conditions the weapon might have been ordered. The surviving records show real preparation. They also show that the weapon was never released. That leaves a space where certainty becomes difficult. But uncertainty does not make the plan less important. It makes it more revealing. Britain built the capacity. That is the historical fact. The order never came. That is the narrow escape. Winston Churchill understood the language of extreme war better than almost any British leader. He could inspire courage, defend democracy, and still consider terrible weapons if he believed national survival required them. This contradiction is not unique to Churchill. It belongs to wartime leadership. The same person can stand against tyranny and authorize planning that would produce suffering on an enormous scale. Churchill's government explored poison gas and biological options partly because Britain feared German retaliation or invasion and wanted every possible weapon available. In total war, preparation becomes insurance. The more frightening the enemy, the easier it becomes to insure against him with something equally frightening. But insurance can become temptation. A weapon created for retaliation still exists when opportunities change. A stockpile built for deterrence can be used by a leader under pressure. A secret plan can survive the fear that created it. Operation Vegetarian reached readiness as the military situation in Europe began to shift decisively. The Allies invaded Normandy in June 1944. German forces were pushed back. The need for a desperate biological strike diminished. Using anthrax would have contaminated territory Allied troops expected to enter and civilians they claimed to be liberating. The strategic logic weakened. The operation was abandoned. The 5 million cakes were eventually destroyed. Burned. Reduced to ash rather than scattered over German fields. The world came close to a biological attack that might have transformed the end of the war and poisoned parts of Europe for generations. Then the weapon disappeared into incinerators and secrecy. But Gruinard could not be burned so easily. The island remained. The soil remembered. This is where the story splits into two timelines. In one timeline, Operation Vegetarian was never used, and Britain avoided releasing anthrax across Germany. In the other, the test site had already been used, and the consequences continued quietly off the Scottish coast. The war ended. Soldiers came home. Government celebrated victory. Porton Down continued its work. Gruinard stayed behind warning signs. That is the first major rehook of the story. Britain destroyed the weapon. It could not destroy the evidence. For local communities, the island's contamination became a strange public secret. The government did not advertise what had happened, but fishermen, farmers, journalists, and officials knew enough to understand that landing on Gruinard was dangerous. Warning notices were posted. Access was prohibited. The island became separated from ordinary geography. You could see it. You could not visit it. That creates a particular kind of fear. A hidden laboratory can be imagined as distant. A forbidden island can be seen from shore. Every calm day, Gruinard sat across the water looking harmless. Sheep could graze on the mainland. Boats could move through the bay. Children could hear stories. Visitors could ask why no one went there. The island's beauty made the danger more unsettling. Nothing visible warned the eye. No crater. No smoke. No ruined buildings. Only grass, rock, sea, and contamination. This is another reason the story has viral potential. The island looks safe. The soil is not. For decades, the government faced the problem of what to do with Gruinard. Anthrax spores persisted in the ground. Early attempts or proposals for cleanup were difficult, expensive, and uncertain. The science of decontaminating an entire natural landscape was not simple. Officials had to consider whether intervention might spread contamination further. Leaving the island closed was easier than proving it safe. So closure became policy. Warning signs became infrastructure. Time became the cleanup plan. But time did not solve the problem. Even by 1979, government-linked testing could still detect spores in part of the island. Nearly 4 decades after the wartime experiments, the biological weapon remained alive enough to be recovered from soil. Think about that. The bombs had been detonated when Churchill was Prime Minister. The spores remained when Margaret Thatcher entered Downing Street. The world had moved from propeller aircraft to nuclear missiles, from wartime radio to color television, from empire to decolonization. Gruinard was still contaminated. A weapon designed for one war had survived into another age. And Britain still did not know how to make the island normal again. The silence around Gruinard began to attract journalists. In 1962, a BBC reporter named Fife Robertson travelled to investigate what local people called the mysterious Island of Death. The footage is remarkable because it captures a moment when official secrecy and local knowledge collided in public. Robertson approached the story not as distant wartime history but as a living danger sitting off the Scottish coast. He spoke with the theatrical seriousness of early television reporting. This was not folklore, he explained. The story began in 1942. The BBC investigation helped bring the island into national awareness. Viewers saw the warning signs, heard the rumours, and learned that a British island had been contaminated during secret biological warfare experiments. But awareness did not produce immediate cleanup. The island remained closed for decades after the broadcast. This is an important retention turn. The secret was exposed. Nothing changed. Why? Because exposure is not the same as accountability. A government may admit a problem without accepting the cost of solving it. It may say the danger is contained. It may rely on distance and public fatigue. The island was uninhabited. The contamination was geographically limited. No large voting population lived there. Cleanup could be postponed. Gruinard was dangerous enough to ban. Not politically important enough to restore. That imbalance lasted until someone decided to make the danger portable. Enter Dark Harvest. The name was chosen perfectly. A harvest is what a farmer gathers from land. The harvest from Gruinard was contaminated soil. The group announced itself through letters and carefully staged deliveries. It claimed that members, including people with scientific knowledge, had landed on the island and removed a large quantity of earth. It threatened to place samples at locations around Britain. The first delivery went to Porton Down. Where better to return the seeds of death, the group suggested, than the place from which they came? The language was dramatic. The method was terrifying. The political logic was clear. If the government believed Gruinard was safely isolated, Dark Harvest would destroy the isolation. If officials could ignore the island because it was remote, the group would move the island into British public life. If contamination could be contained by geography, geography would be broken. This was environmental protest transformed into a biological threat. It was also an act of historical accusation. Dark Harvest did not create the anthrax. Britain had. The group weaponized the government's own abandoned weapon against its reputation. That is what made the campaign so effective. The Porton down soil tested positive. The second sample near the Conservative conference did not, though it was linked by soil type to the island. The uncertainty increased fear. Were there more samples? Had contaminated soil been placed elsewhere? Who had access? Could the group strike again? Police investigated. No one was publicly identified and convicted as the mastermind of the campaign. Local silence protected the mystery. Some people may have known more than they said. The commandos disappeared almost as suddenly as they appeared. But their objective had been achieved. The island was no longer safely forgotten. The government had to act. And now another question enters the story. How do you clean an island poisoned with anthrax? The answer would involve protective suits, vaccination, seawater, chemical treatment, soil removal, monitoring, and one final test using animals. The British government was about to repeat part of the original experiment. This time, the sheep were not there to die. They were there to prove the island could live again. The cleanup began in the 1980s, more than 40 years after the first wartime tests. By then, the government could no longer rely on warning signs and distance. Dark harvest had shown that contaminated soil could be removed. Public pressure had grown. Scientific methods had improved. The island had become a symbol of state secrecy and environmental abandonment. Teams returned wearing protective equipment. The operation had to do something no one had attempted there at full scale: reduce contamination across a natural landscape until officials could defend the claim that ordinary access was safe again. The main treatment used a large quantity of formaldehyde solution diluted with seawater and applied to contaminated areas. Some soil was also removed for disposal. The work was not a simple matter of spraying a surface once and leaving. The island had uneven ground, vegetation, buried material, and decades of weather acting on contamination. Teams had to identify where viable spores remained and treat those areas systematically. This is one reason the cleanup took so long to begin. Cleaning a room is easy to imagine. Cleaning an island is not. Where does the contamination end? How deep is it? What happens beneath rocks? What happens inside old burial pits? What happens when rain moves soil? What happens if the treatment kills spores in one place and washes contaminated material into another? The original experiment had treated Gruinard like a closed laboratory. The cleanup had to confront the truth. An island is not a laboratory. It has weather. It has water. It has animals. It has slopes. It has a history of everything placed in its soil. Teams treated the contaminated ground and then monitored the results. But chemical readings and laboratory samples were not enough to create public confidence. The government needed a living test. Sheep were returned to Gruinard. This time, they were allowed to graze. The image closes a circle that had been open since 1942. The first sheep had been tethered as test victims. The later sheep became witnesses. If they remained healthy over time, the government could argue that the island no longer posed the same danger. The animals survived. In April 1990, a junior defense minister went to Gruinard and formally removed the warning signs. The island was declared safe. Reporters watched. Officials walked on land that had been forbidden for almost half a century. The announcement was designed as closure. Britain had poisoned an island. Britain had cleaned it. The story was over. Except it was not. The island's ownership carried another layer of symbolism. The government had acquired Gruinard during the war for a small sum. After decontamination, it offered the island back to the heirs of the original owner for the same nominal price. That return sounded neat. Property restored. Warnings removed. Sheep alive. File closed. But history does not reset because land changes hands. The original owner's family inherited not the island that existed before 1942, but an island marked permanently by what the state had done. Even if the cleanup worked, Gruinard would remain Anthrax Island in public memory. Its value, identity, and future had all been changed by a secret military experiment. The government could return the deed. It could not return innocence. That is the deeper meaning of cleanup. Remediation can reduce danger. It cannot erase responsibility. And then, decades after Gruinard was declared safe, the island reappeared in another kind of headline. In 2022, a wildfire swept across much of the island. Photographs showed smoke and flame over the old test site. The immediate reports did not indicate a renewed anthrax danger, and the island had long been officially cleared. But the imagery revived old fears. Fire moving across Anthrax Island sounded like the beginning of a story Britain thought it had finished. Would heat disturb contaminated soil? Could spores survive? Was the cleanup truly complete? The questions returned because trust had never fully returned. This is another lesson of secrecy. When a government hides an experiment for decades, later reassurance carries less weight. Even correct statements are heard through the memory of earlier concealment. Gruinard may have been safe, but the public knew that officials had once treated the island as a secret and left it closed for generations. That history follows every new event. The fire did not recreate the wartime weapon. It recreated the doubt. And the doubt is still visible in an unexpected place. A government accounting document. In 2026, British central government estimates continued to list an unquantifiable contingent liability connected to Gruinard Island. The wording refers to an indemnity in the event of claims arising from an outbreak involving specific anthrax strains on the island. The island was declared safe in 1990. The warning signs came down. The sheep survived. The government sold the island back. And more than 3 decades later, the state still carried a financial liability it could not quantify. That does not mean an outbreak is expected. It means the legal shadow of the experiment remains. This is the perfect final rehook for a modern audience. The war ended in 1945. The island reopened in 1990. But in 2026, the British government still could not place a number on the risk it had created. The plan was secret. The liability is public. The cost is listed as unquantifiable. That single word contains the whole story. Unquantifiable. How much would the weapon have cost Germany if used? No fixed figure. How much did the test cost the island? No reliable number. How much fear did it create along the Scottish coast? No final price. How much trust was lost when the truth emerged? A risk beyond a clean estimate. How much does a government owe a landscape it turned into a weapon? The spreadsheet has no answer. History does. To understand the moral scale of Operation Vegetarian, imagine the plan not from the perspective of a bomber crew or government committee, but from the ground. A German farmer wakes to find small pieces of cattle feed scattered across fields. The objects do not explode. They do not smoke. They do not carry obvious markings. The cattle eat. Days later, animals become ill and die. Veterinarians investigate. Carcasses are moved. Workers handle them. Families consume meat from animals infected before anyone understands the pattern. Fields become suspect. Herds are destroyed. Roadblocks appear. Food distribution collapses. Rumors spread faster than official information. Is the milk safe? Is the soil safe? Is the next village infected? Has the enemy poisoned the countryside? A biological attack does not only kill. It destroys confidence in ordinary life. Every animal becomes a possible carrier. Every field becomes a possible weapon. Every meal becomes a question. The plan's strategic purpose was to attack food and morale together. Even people who never became infected could suffer from famine, panic, forced slaughter, economic collapse, and the breakdown of trust. This is why calling the targets cattle cakes can make the plan sound smaller than it was. The cakes were delivery devices. The target was society. The operation also raises a question about retaliation. If Britain had used anthrax after a German biological attack, would that have made the operation morally different? Retaliation can feel like justice when a nation is under threat. But biological weapons do not strike only decision-makers. They do not remain neatly within the borders of guilt. German civilians who opposed Hitler would have suffered. Forced laborers, prisoners, occupied peoples, and Allied captives inside Germany might have been exposed. Contamination might have crossed borders. Allied troops advancing into Germany could have entered poisoned territory. The weapon could not distinguish Nazi from anti-Nazi. It could not distinguish soldier from child. It could not distinguish the guilty state from the innocent body. That is the problem with weapons of mass destruction. They turn categories of politics into landscapes of suffering. Britain's decision not to use Operation Vegetarian prevented one of the most unpredictable biological catastrophes of the war. But the fact that the plan reached such an advanced stage tells us how close total war can bring democratic governments to methods they would later condemn. The line between civilization and barbarism is not the line between countries. It runs through every government under fear. Porton Down became the symbol of that line. To defenders, it was a place where Britain researched threats, built protection, and prepared for attacks enemies might launch. Scientific work there contributed to national defense and public safety. To critics, Porton became associated with secrecy, dangerous experiments, and ethical questions hidden behind military necessity. Both images belong to its history. Science under national security is rarely simple. Researchers may develop vaccines while studying weapons. They may learn how to treat disease by understanding how disease can be spread. They may protect soldiers through experiments that put other people or animals at risk. The same knowledge can defend and destroy. Gruinard emerged from that W's world. The anthrax trials produced information about biological warfare. They also produced a contaminated island. The knowledge could be stored in files. The contamination had to be stored in geography. That is one reason secret weapons programs often leave physical legacies far from the laboratories that designed them. Test ranges, islands, deserts, coastlines, bunkers, burial pits, abandoned buildings, and contaminated soil become the true archive. Governments can classify documents. They cannot classify the land forever. Eventually, erosion, activists, journalists, court cases, or budgets bring the story back. Gruinard was Britain's archive in the sea. Dark Harvest opened it. There is something else that makes the Dark Harvest episode so compelling. The group turned the government's own logic against it. Officials had treated Gruinard as safe because it was isolated. Dark Harvest proved isolation was political, not natural. A small boat could reach the island. A shovel could lift soil. A car could carry it across Britain. A bucket could appear outside Porton Down. The government had relied on citizens obeying warning signs. The protesters did not. This was not merely a publicity stunt. It exposed a real vulnerability. If untrained or poorly protected people could land and remove contaminated soil, then the island was not safely contained. It was only socially contained by secrecy, fear, and distance. Dark Harvest broke all three. The group used mystery as protection. No public leadership? No press conference with identifiable organizers. Letters. Deliveries. Threats. Then silence. That anonymity increased the campaign's power. The government could not negotiate easily. Police could not produce a satisfying arrest. The public could imagine almost anyone behind it: scientists, local activists, nationalists, environmentalists, veterans, or people with personal knowledge of the island. The unanswered identity became part of the story. Who harvested the soil? Decades later, the mystery still helps the event survive in memory. A named campaign becomes history. An unnamed group becomes legend. But the campaign's moral status is complicated. Moving contaminated soil created danger. Even if the group believed it was forcing cleanup, it risked exposing workers, police, scientists, and the public. It used biological fear to make a political point. The second sample near a party conference increased the possibility of panic and accidental harm. This is not a clean story of heroic activists defeating an irresponsible state. It is a story of one dangerous act answering another. The government created the contamination. Dark Harvest made the contamination mobile. Both relied on the fear of anthrax. The difference was scale, authority, and purpose. The States Act came from wartime weapons research. The Activists Act came from frustration after decades of inaction. Understanding the difference does not require romanticizing the risk. That moral tension makes the story stronger. The viewer should be left asking, when a government refuses to clean up its own weapon, what forms of protest remain legitimate? There is no comfortable answer. Gruinard had a history before it became a weapons site. That history matters because military stories often begin when the military arrives, as if the land existed only to receive the experiment. The island's name reaches back through Gaelic and Norse layers. It had been used for grazing and connected to the working life of the surrounding coast. In the 19th century, a small number of people had lived there. By the time the government selected it for wartime trials, it was uninhabited, but uninhabited does not mean meaningless. It belonged to an estate. It belonged to local geography. It belonged to memory. The government acquired the island for £500 and accepted responsibility for the contamination it expected to create. The understanding was that the owner or the owner's heirs could buy it back for the same price when it was safe again. The promise sounded practical. The experiment would happen. The war would end. The island would be cleaned. The land would be returned. No one imagined the promise would take nearly half a century to fulfill. This is one reason the £500 figure is so powerful in the story. The government paid a small price for the land. It assumed an unquantifiable price for the consequences. The original financial transaction treated Gruinard like property. The contamination transformed it into liability. The island received a wartime designation associated with secrecy, Base X. That name stripped away geography and history. Gruinard was a place. Base X was a function. Military systems rename locations because names can reveal too much. A neutral designation protects secrecy and simplifies logistics. But renaming also changes moral perception. It is easier to contaminate Base X than to contaminate a Scottish island visible from homes and farms. It is easier to write about test subjects and dispersal zones than sheep and grass. It is easier to discuss a restricted area than a landscape someone expects to inherit. Bureaucratic language creates distance. Distance creates permission. Base X became a place where the ordinary rules could be suspended. The men who carried out the experiments arrived through a carefully managed wartime operation. Equipment moved by boat. The animals were transported. Observation points were established. Cameras recorded the tests. Protective procedures were followed according to the knowledge and equipment available at the time. The surviving film is among the most disturbing parts of the archive. It does not look like cinema. There is no dramatic music. No narrator warning that history is about to change. The camera shows technicians, equipment, animals, smoke, and the controlled seriousness of official work. That calmness makes the footage more unsettling. The men are not behaving like villains. They are behaving like professionals. This is how terrible systems usually look from the inside. Procedural. Measured. Documented. The evil is not theatrical. It is organized. When the film became publicly accessible decades later, viewers could see what rumors had only suggested. Sheep had been placed in the path of a biological cloud. The animals became data. Their deaths became proof. The island became a graph that continued for 48 years. Archival film changes historical memory because it removes the protection of abstraction. A sentence saying sheep died is one thing. Watching living animals standing on a green island before exposure is another. The viewer knows what the animals do not. That knowledge creates dread. The sheep tests also raise the question of animal suffering in military research. Animals have been used throughout the history of weapons testing, medicine, toxicology, and defense science. Governments argue that animal experiments can protect human life by revealing danger, improving treatments, or testing equipment. Critics argue that animals become unwilling victims of human conflict, suffering for decisions they cannot understand. On Gruinard, the sheep were not being tested for a cure. They were being used to prove lethality. Their deaths were the intended result. That distinction matters. The animals were surrogates for German cattle. German cattle were surrogates for the German food system. The food system was a surrogate for the civilian population. The chain moved from sheep to society. The test animals were the first bodies in a weapon designed to reach millions. This does not mean the sheep were morally equivalent to human victims. It means the experiment's purpose was visible in miniature. The island was Germany reduced to a test field. The flock was a nation's food supply reduced to a sample. The bomb was a continental catastrophe reduced to one detonation. That is how weapons testing works. It compresses the imagined future into a controlled present. Gruinard's tragedy is that the control failed after the test was complete. Why do anthrax spores persist so long? The simple answer is that the bacterium can form a highly resistant dormant state adapted to survival under harsh environmental conditions. In that form, it can remain in soil and later expose grazing animals when circumstances allow. The important historical point is not the biological mechanism in technical detail. It is the mismatch between military time and ecological time. Military planners operate in campaigns, seasons, budgets, and wars. Spores operate in decades. A government may think in terms of victory next year. The organism remains after the government changes. This mismatch appears in many military environmental legacies. Mines remain after peace. Chemical contamination remains after factories close. Radioactive material remains after test programs end. Unexploded bombs remain beneath cities. Fuel, solvents, metals, and waste remain under abandoned bases. Weapons are designed for moments. Landscapes inherit durations. Gruinard belongs in the same moral geography as nuclear test islands, chemical ranges, contaminated deserts, and military dumping grounds. In each case, a remote place is selected because fewer politically powerful people live there. The place absorbs risk on behalf of a state or alliance. When the strategic purpose ends, the contamination stays local while the benefit was national. The comparison is not exact. Anthrax is not radiation. A Scottish island is not a Pacific atoll inhabited at the time of nuclear testing. But the governing logic is similar. Remote land is easier to sacrifice. The people near it have less influence. Secrecy reduces resistance. National security postpones cleanup. Then future generations inherit the test. This is one reason the story resonates with American audiences as well as British ones. The United States created its own biological warfare program during the Second World War and expanded research during the Cold War before ending its offensive program. American history also contains open-air tests, secret programs, environmental legacies, and communities asked to trust institutions that withheld information. Gruinard is British. The pattern is not. The story asks a broader democratic question. What happens when a government creates danger in secret for reasons it calls national survival? Who has the right to know? Who accepts the risk? Who pays for cleanup? Who decides when the danger has passed? These questions do not end with one island. They belong to every secret weapons program. The British home front in 1942 helps explain why ordinary moral boundaries weakened. Cities had been bombed. Families had lost homes. U-boats threatened food imports. The possibility of invasion had recently felt real. Nazi Germany had occupied much of Europe and carried out mass murder on a scale the world was only beginning to understand. Within that context, the idea of destroying German cattle could be presented not as cruelty but as survival. This is important because historical judgment becomes weak if it ignores fear. The planners were not working in a peaceful country inventing suffering for amusement. They were working inside an existential war against a genocidal regime. That context explains the plan. It does not remove the moral problem. Understanding is not absolution. The strongest documentaries hold both. Britain was fighting a monstrous enemy. Britain prepared a monstrous weapon. The two facts exist together. This is where the script should ask the viewer directly. If you believed Hitler might use disease first, what would you prepare? If your cities were burning, what line would you refuse to cross? If a weapon could shorten the war, would you build it? If using it might poison Europe after liberation, would you still consider it? The questions work because there is no easy answer from a safe distance. Most people want to believe they would reject biological warfare. Most people have not governed a country in 1942. But the reverse is also true. Wartime fear cannot become a blank check. The fact that leaders face terrible choices does not make every choice defensible. Operation Vegetarian sits inside that tension. It was understandable enough to be prepared. Terrible enough never to be used. The operation's quiet name also belongs to a wider British tradition of coded military language. Operation names can sound random, humorous, or bureaucratic. They conceal purpose, simplify communication, and sometimes protect morale. But vegetarian has a special darkness because the name appears to invert the target. A plan to kill livestock and destroy meat supplies is given a word associated with not eating meat. The title almost mocks the future victims. That contrast makes the operation memorable on YouTube, but the script should not rely on the name alone. The true hook is the distance between language and consequence. Governments regularly soften violence with words. Collateral damage. Area denial. Degrading capacity. Neutralizing targets. Contingent liability. The operation hidden behind that harmless title. The language reduces emotional resistance. A cake is easier to discuss than biological warfare. A livestock target is easier to discuss than famine. A retaliatory option is easier to discuss than poisoned soil across a civilian landscape. The script's job is to reverse the softening. To translate the euphemism back into reality. The cakes were not food. The target was not only cattle. The island was not merely a test site. The liability was not merely financial. Each harmless word concealed a harsher fact. The story of the 13 women associated with the preparation work deserves attention because it shows how total war reached into ordinary labor. They were not famous scientists or cabinet ministers. They were workers performing secret tasks inside a production chain. Their exact personal experiences are less documented in popular memory than the names of Fields and Churchill. Yet without people like them, the plan could not have moved from paper to stockpile. Imagine the repetition. One piece after another. A workday organized around material whose full purpose may have been compartmentalized. The danger was controlled through procedure. The product accumulated. Hundreds of thousands. Then millions. This is the industrial face of weapons of mass destruction. Mass destruction requires mass production. It requires schedules, quotas, storage, transportation, inspection, and ordinary labor. The terrifying weapon does not emerge fully formed from a laboratory. It moves through a supply chain. That supply chain contains people who may understand only part of what they are helping create. The moral burden is therefore distributed unevenly. The scientist knows more than the worker. The official knows more than the company. The cabinet knows more than the public. The pilot might know only the mission. The farmer below knows nothing. Secrecy creates a ladder of knowledge. Those at the bottom carry risk without context. Those at the top possess context without direct exposure. Gruinard reverses that ladder. The scientists left. The island carried the exposure. The local people carried the rumors. The state carried the secret. The public inherited the bill. For years after the war, annual inspections and periodic sampling tracked the contamination. These visits created an eerie rhythm. Officials arrived. Samples were taken. Results were recorded. The island stayed closed. Each inspection confirmed that the story was not over. This is unlike a ruined building that can be demolished or a damaged ship that can be scrapped. The danger was invisible. The government needed laboratory tests to know whether the land was still dangerous. Ordinary senses were useless. You could stand on the beach and see nothing. You could touch the soil and feel nothing. You could breathe the air and know nothing. Invisible contamination changes the relationship between people and place. Trust moves from the body to the institution. The government says it is dangerous, so you stay away. Later the government says it is safe, so you are asked to return. But if the government hid the original experiment, why should its later reassurance be accepted easily? That is the trust problem at the heart of Anthrax Island. Science can measure risk. Only honesty can rebuild trust. The 1962 BBC report succeeded because it made official distance look absurd. Here was an island visible from the Scottish coast, poisoned by the British state, still forbidden 2 decades after the experiments, and surrounded by unanswered questions. The story did not need conspiracy. The confirmed facts were strange enough. That is a lesson for the script's tone. Do not exaggerate the island into supernatural horror. Do not claim it remains deadly today when it was officially decontaminated. Do not suggest secret ongoing experiments without evidence. The truth has stronger hooks. Britain deliberately contaminated an island. The spores persisted for decades. Activists carried contaminated soil across the country. The government spent years cleaning the land. The island was declared safe. An unquantifiable indemnity still appears in government accounts. Accuracy makes the story more disturbing, not less. Because the government does not have to be hiding a new secret. The old secret is enough. Operation Vegetarian also belongs to the history of international attempts to ban certain forms of warfare. After the horrors of chemical weapons in the First World War, the Geneva Protocol of 1925 prohibited the use of chemical and biological weapons in war. But prohibition of use did not immediately end research, stockpiling, or preparation. States feared being caught defenseless if an enemy violated the agreement. Some maintained reservations connected to retaliation. Others continued secret programs while publicly supporting norms against first use. This created a dangerous paradox. Every state could say it was preparing only because another state might cheat. If all sides followed that logic, everyone prepared. The existence of the ban made the weapons shameful. The fear of violation made the weapons persistent. Operation Vegetarian lived inside that contradiction. Britain was a country committed, at least formally, to rules limiting biological warfare. It was also a country producing millions of contaminated cattle cakes and testing anthrax on a Scottish island. The government could reconcile those positions through the word retaliation. But the landscape could not understand legal reservations. Gruinard was contaminated whether the plan was defensive, retaliatory, or offensive. This is another reason the island matters historically. It shows the gap between the legal category of a weapon and the material reality of preparing it. A treaty can prohibit use. A test can still poison land. A stockpile can still exist. A scientist can still develop delivery methods. A government can still move closer to the line while insisting it has not crossed it. The line on paper remained. The spores entered the soil. Germany also explored biological warfare questions, though the history of Nazi decision-making is complex and the regime did not launch the kind of large-scale biological attack Britain feared. Japanese forces, however, committed horrific biological warfare crimes in China through Unit 731 and related programs. The wider war therefore contained real evidence that states were willing to experiment on humans and deploy disease. That context deepened Allied fear. News about enemy atrocities was incomplete during the war, but the possibility of biological attack was not fantasy. Governments knew disease could be weaponized. They did not know exactly what enemies had prepared. Intelligence uncertainty encouraged worst-case planning. This is how arms races begin. One side imagines what the other might possess. It builds a response. The other side sees preparation and builds more. Secrecy prevents reassurance. Every unknown becomes a threat. Biological weapons intensify this problem because research can have peaceful and military uses. A laboratory studying a pathogen may be developing treatment, defense, or attack. Outsiders cannot easily tell. The same knowledge can support all three. The result is suspicion. Operation Vegetarian was Britain's answer to a threat that might come. Gruinard was the price paid for certainty. The war's biological fear also connected Britain to Allied scientific cooperation. The United States and Canada developed their own capabilities and worked with Britain in broader wartime biological defense and weapons research. The Allied programs shared information, strains, production knowledge, and strategic concerns at different points. The details belong to secret institutions far removed from ordinary public oversight. This gives the story a transatlantic dimension. Anthrax Island was Scottish. The biological warfare race was international. American audiences should not see Gruinard as a uniquely British moral failure belonging safely to another country. The US biological weapons program expanded during and after the war. American military research also produced open-air tests and environmental questions that were not fully understood by the public at the time. The lesson is not that Britain and America were the same in every detail. The lesson is that democratic alliance did not prevent secret preparation for mass biological violence. The enemies were terrifying. The response became terrifying too. This is where the phrase "the good war" becomes complicated. The Second World War was fought against regimes responsible for aggression, occupation, racial extermination, and mass murder. Defeating Nazi Germany was necessary. But necessity did not make every Allied decision morally clean. Strategic bombing, internment, colonial exploitation, atomic weapons, and biological planning all belong to the same history of democracies making extreme choices under total war. Operation Vegetarian should not be used to create false equivalence between Britain and Nazi Germany. It should be used to reject moral simplicity. The Allies could fight for a just outcome while considering unjust methods. A country can be on the right side of a war and still prepare something wrong. That is a harder lesson than hero worship. It is also more useful. The public did not know most of this during the war. Secrecy was expected. Britain censored information, protected military sites, controlled reporting, and asked citizens to trust the government. In wartime, secrecy can save lives. An enemy cannot counter a weapon it does not know exists. But secrecy also prevents democratic scrutiny. Citizens cannot object to a plan they have never heard of. Operation Vegetarian therefore raises a question that extends beyond wartime. How long should national security secrecy last? During the operation, secrecy protected the plan. After abandonment, secrecy protected the government from embarrassment and legal responsibility. After the war, continued opacity delayed public understanding of why Gruinard remained closed. At some point, secrecy stopped protecting Britain from Germany. It began protecting institutions from Britain. That transition is difficult to date exactly. It is easy to defend secrecy when bombers are overhead. Harder when decades have passed. By the time the BBC investigated in 1962, Hitler was dead, Germany was divided, NATO existed, and Britain was entering a new world. Yet the island story still lived behind official caution. Dark Harvest emerged because the normal routes of accountability seemed too slow. The group's identity has never been conclusively resolved in public. That mystery encourages speculation. Scottish nationalists, environmental activists, scientists, local residents, a mixture? People connected to universities? People with inside knowledge? The campaign's own messages claimed scientific capacity, but anonymous political groups often shape their identities strategically. What matters is that the group seemed to understand both symbolism and risk. Porton Down was chosen because it connected the soil to the state's weapons program. The Conservative Party conference was chosen because it connected the issue to national politics and media attention. The letters were written to sound ominous. The name Dark Harvest connected soil, farming, death, and revenge. The campaign had narrative discipline. It knew how to make a forgotten environmental problem impossible to ignore. In that sense, Dark Harvest behaved like a modern viral campaign before social media existed. It created a physical hook. One ordinary bucket of earth. It created a question. Is it contaminated? It created escalation. A second delivery. It created mystery. Who did it? It created a clear demand. Decontaminate Gruinard. The campaign understood attention better than the government did. That is why the 1981 opening works so well for a documentary. The audience begins with an object. The object contains a disease. The disease contains a war. The war contains an island. The island contains a plan for 5 million cakes. Each reveal becomes larger than the last. This is exactly how top history channels hold viewers. They do not begin with the whole explanation. They open a series of locked doors. The first key is the soil. Local oral history around Gruinard kept the story alive when official information was limited. People living near the bay remembered unusual animal deaths, military activity, warning signs, boats kept away, and the knowledge that the island was dangerous. Stories grow in the gaps left by secrecy. Some details become exaggerated. Others preserve truths institutions prefer not to discuss. This relationship between rumor and secrecy is important. Governments often dismiss rumors as misinformation. But secrecy creates the conditions in which rumors thrive. If officials refuse to explain why animals died, people invent explanations. If an island is prohibited without a transparent account, mystery becomes community knowledge. If decades pass without cleanup, distrust becomes tradition. The answer to rumor is not only correction. It is openness. Gruinard became legendary because the government left the public with enough evidence to fear and too little information to understand. The island's local visibility made the official silence especially awkward. This was not a distant overseas test range. It sat off Scotland. People could point to it from shore. The state's biological warfare legacy was part of the view. Imagine living beside it. Weather moves across the bay. Birds cross freely. The water connects island and mainland. Yet humans are told the danger is contained by a sign. The idea feels fragile because it is fragile. Dark Harvest proved that. The cleanup cost discussed in Parliament during the 1980s was estimated at up to hundreds of thousands of pounds, a significant sum but small compared with national defence budgets. The political record also contains moments of flippancy, including a parliamentary joke about who might live on the island once it was safe. The joke is revealing. Officials can turn danger into humour when they are distant from it. For local people and those conducting the cleanup, the contamination was not a joke. For the animals exposed in 1942, it was not a joke. For police and workers handling suspicious soil in 1981, it was not a joke. Humor can relieve tension. It can also expose indifference. The contrast belongs in the story because it shows how government language changes once a crisis becomes an old file. What was once a secret national weapon becomes a curious item in parliamentary business. The suffering and fear are compressed into cost estimates and banter. This is how institutions domesticate scandal. They make it administrative. The cleanup teams had to reverse the domestication. For them, the old file was still biological reality. Protective vaccination and clothing were used because the risk had to be taken seriously. The work involved careful application of decontaminant, sampling, and monitoring. The operation's success depended on understanding where contamination remained rather than treating the whole island as equally dangerous. Surveys had shown that contamination was concentrated in limited areas, especially near the original test zones and within the upper layers of soil. This made remediation more practical than earlier fears suggested. The entire island did not need to be physically removed or burned. Specific areas could be treated intensely and then tested. This is an important correction to the myth. Gruinard was not uniformly lethal across every inch for 48 years. The contamination was real, persistent, and serious, but it was spatially concentrated. Accuracy matters because exaggerated claims weaken trust. The true fact is strong enough. Decades after the tests, viable spores remained in the soil of the test area. That is extraordinary. The treatment with formaldehyde solution and seawater was selected after smaller studies showed it could inactivate spores under the conditions found on the island. The operation required large-scale application across the contaminated zone. Some material was removed where necessary. Follow-up sampling assessed whether viable contamination remained. Then came the sheep. Their survival provided a public symbol science reports alone could not. The government needed the island not only to be safe. It needed the island to look safe. Healthy sheep did what official language could not. They created an image of restored normality. Grass. Animals. No deaths. The same species used to prove the weapon worked was used to prove the cleanup worked. That symmetry is almost too perfect for storytelling. In 1942, sheep died so Britain could prepare a biological weapon. In the late 1980s, sheep lived so Britain could close the file. The island's official reopening in 1990 took place in front of cameras because secrecy was no longer useful. The cleanup needed publicity. The minister removing the warning signs became a ritual act of state reassurance. The gesture said the government had mastered the consequences of its past. The sign came down. The island returned to civilian status. The owner's heirs could repurchase it for the same £500. But the ceremony also revealed how much states rely on symbols. A sign is easy to remove. A reputation is not. The words Anthrax Island remained. They remain now. The public does not call it Formaldehyde Island. It does not call it Decontaminated Island. The dangerous name survived the danger. That is the power of historical branding. One secret act can rename a place for generations. Gruinard's later owners faced a peculiar inheritance. They owned a private island, but not an ordinary one. Public curiosity remained intense. Journalists, filmmakers, historians, tourists, conspiracy enthusiasts, and adventurers continued to treat it as a symbol. The island's market value could never be separated from its history. Its privacy could never be complete because its story belonged to national memory. The government had returned the land. The public had claimed the legend. That legend entered novels, documentaries, podcasts, articles, and television. Writers used Gruinard as a setting because it combines natural beauty with invisible danger. It is a ready-made Gothic landscape, an island in cold water, an abandoned secret, government experiments, dead animals, warning signs, anonymous activists, and contamination that outlives war. But the story is not fiction. That is why fictional versions must compete with the archive. The real Operation Vegetarian is already more disturbing than most invented plots. A fictional villain might plan 5 million poison cakes. A democratic government actually produced them. A fictional secret island might remain dangerous for decades. Gruinard did. A thriller might invent anonymous commandos returning contaminated soil. Dark Harvest did that too. The facts do not need supernatural enhancement. The island's cultural afterlife also creates a risk. Every retelling can become more sensational. Some videos imply the island remains forbidden today. Others suggest any visitor would die. Some blur the difference between anthrax bacteria and viruses. Some exaggerate casualty certainty from the unused operation. Some treat cleanup as fraudulent without evidence. A responsible script must distinguish historical danger from current status. Gruinard was officially declared safe in 1990 after decontamination and monitoring. It is privately owned. It is not an open tourist attraction. The government still carries an indemnity related to possible claims, but that does not prove active contamination. The strongest conclusion is not that Britain is lying today. It is that Britain created a legacy serious enough to remain on official liability lists decades after declaring the site safe. That is more precise. And precision is more haunting than conspiracy. The story gained a new resonance after the Anthrax letter attacks in the United States in 2001. For Americans, anthrax suddenly stopped being a word from veterinary medicine or Cold War history. Letters containing spores were mailed to media, offices, and US senators. People died. Postal workers were exposed. Government buildings were closed and decontaminated. Fear spread through ordinary mail. The attacks were far smaller than Operation Vegetarian. Their psychological impact was enormous. They showed how a biological agent can turn normal systems into sources of suspicion. An envelope. A sorting machine. A desk. A ventilation system. Objects used every day became possible routes of danger. The same logic had existed in Britain's wartime plan. The cattle cake was effective as an idea because it looked ordinary. The anthrax letter was terrifying because it looked ordinary. Biological weapons hide inside trust. Food is trusted. Mail is trusted. Soil is trusted. Air is trusted. The weapon turns the trusted object into the threat. This connection makes Gruinard relevant to US audiences. The island is not merely an obscure British wartime curiosity. It is an early case study in environmental biological contamination, state secrecy, public fear, and the difficulty of proving a place safe after exposure. The 2001 attacks also reminded governments how difficult decontamination can be even inside buildings. Gruinard represented the same problem at landscape scale decades earlier. How do you define clean? Does clean mean no detectable spores in samples? Does it mean an acceptably low probability of exposure? Does it mean animals remain healthy? Does it mean officials are willing to remove warning signs? Does it mean the public believes them? Safety is scientific. Confidence is political. The two are related, but not identical. After a biological incident, every negative test helps. One positive test can restart fear. This is why Gruinard's 2026 contingent liability has such symbolic power. The liability does not mean the island is unsafe. It means the government recognizes a category of risk that cannot be reduced to zero in legal language. The indemnity protects against claims if certain strains associated with the island are involved in a future outbreak. The line appears among many other government liabilities. Nuclear risks. Environmental cleanup. Military contracts. Legal claims. Then Gruinard. A small island listed beside some of the largest and most complex risks of the modern state. This placement says something. The island may be geographically minor. Its legacy is institutionally durable. Government accounts are not written for drama, but sometimes bureaucracy produces the strongest final image. Decades after the cleanup ceremony, the state still carries the experiment as a footnote with no fixed value. The warning sign was removed from the shore. A different warning remained in the budget. This is the kind of detail top documentary channels use near the end because it brings history into the present without inventing a new crisis. The audience thinks the story ended in 1990. Then the script says 2026. The time gap creates shock. The old weapon is not active in the way it was. The old responsibility is. The story also matters because biological risk has changed since 1942. Modern science can identify pathogens more quickly, produce vaccines and treatments more effectively, and monitor outbreaks with tools files could not imagine. At the same time, biotechnology has become more powerful and widely distributed. The possibility of accidents, misuse, and deliberate biological attacks remains part of national security planning. That does not mean the world is on the edge of another Operation Vegetarian. It means the ethical questions remain. How much dangerous research should governments conduct for defense? How should such work be overseen? What information should remain classified? Who is responsible for environmental contamination? How should communities near military sites be informed? What happens when a program is abandoned but its material legacy remains? Gruinard is a warning against treating biological defense as only a laboratory issue. Pathogens interact with landscapes, animals, workers, weather, waste, and time. The boundary around a secure site may exist legally. Biology may not respect it. This is one reason public health agencies still study historical incidents like Gruinard. The island became a real-world example of long-term environmental contamination and later remediation. Lessons from the cleanup can inform planning for deliberate releases, accidents, food system contamination, and recovery after biological incidents. The darkest military experiment produced knowledge later useful for protection. That creates another moral contradiction. Can knowledge gained through a harmful experiment become good? Yes. Does later usefulness justify the original act? No. History often leaves societies with valuable knowledge obtained through unacceptable means. The ethical response is not to discard every lesson. It is to use the lesson while remembering the cost and refusing to repeat the injustice casually. Gruinard can teach decontamination. It can also teach humility. The island's ecological recovery raises questions beyond human safety. Formaldehyde treatment was designed to kill spores, but chemical remediation can affect other organisms and soil processes. Fire, weather, grazing, and time all reshaped the island after the trials. Scientists later studied shore recovery and ecological effects. The island became not only a military history site but a place where contamination and remediation intersected with natural systems. This is a broader problem in environmental cleanup. The method used to remove one hazard can create another form of damage. Digging out soil can disturb habitat. Chemical treatment can harm microbes and vegetation. Burning can move material. Leaving contamination in place protects ecosystems from remediation but maintains risk. There is rarely a perfect solution. The military created a simple objective in 1942. Kill the sheep. The cleanup faced a far more complex objective. Make the island safe without damaging it further. Destruction is often simpler than repair. That may be the most important scientific lesson of the story. The original test took minutes. The consequences lasted decades. The cleanup required years of surveys, planning, treatment, and monitoring. The ceremony declaring safety lasted minutes. This imbalance appears in every form of environmental warfare. A government can release danger quickly. Recovery moves at the pace of soil, budgets, law, and trust. If Operation Vegetarian had been used across Germany, the scale of cleanup would have been almost unimaginable. Gruinard was a small island with a concentrated test area and controlled access. German agricultural regions would have included farms, villages, forests, rivers, roads, animals, workers, and vast movement of people and goods. How would Europe have recovered? Which land would be abandoned? How many animals would be destroyed? How would displaced families return? Would the Allies have entered contaminated zones without knowing? Would post-war hunger deepen? Would Germany's reconstruction begin on poisoned soil? These questions reveal why the unused plan cannot be judged only by projected wartime effect. The aftermath would have become part of European history. Operation Vegetarian might have shortened one phase of war while lengthening another form of suffering. The weapon was intended to destroy Germany's ability to feed itself. But Germany was not an isolated island. Disease, animals, people, and trade cross borders. The attack could have affected occupied countries and neighboring regions. Cattle move. Meat moves. Soil clings to equipment. Refugees travel. Soldiers advance. Rivers continue flowing. Biological warfare turns geography into uncertainty. This is why many military calculations around such weapons are inherently unstable. Models can estimate targets and effects, but living systems interact in ways no planner fully controls. A weapon that spreads through biology is partly surrendered to biology. Gruinard proved that on a tiny scale. The test team chose an island to contain the experiment. Even there, local contamination fears reached the mainland. Scale that up to continental Europe. The word control begins to sound absurd. The unused operation also changes how we interpret British strategic bombing. By 1944, Britain and the United States were already destroying German cities from the air. Hamburg had burned. Berlin was bombed. Civilian casualties were enormous. The moral threshold for mass destruction had been crossed in conventional form. Why, then, was Anthrax different? Partly because of unpredictability. A bombing raid ends physically when the bombs stop falling, though fires, rubble, injury, and trauma continue. Biological contamination may remain active and invisible. It can harm the occupying force, the liberator, the neutral, and the next generation. It creates a battlefield no army can safely enter. Anthrax also carried a taboo. Disease felt different from explosives. It attacked the body through natural processes. It blurred war and plague. It threatened agriculture, civilian life, and post-war recovery. It could not easily be displayed as a precision military action. The taboo did not prevent preparation. It may have helped prevent use. Taboos matter because law alone is not always enough. Leaders also need cultural and moral barriers that make certain actions feel fundamentally unacceptable. Operation Vegetarian sat behind such a barrier. The cakes existed. The taboo held. The story should give the viewer one moment of counterfactual silence. Imagine the aircraft taking off. Imagine the boxes opening over German fields. Imagine farmers finding the cakes. Then stop. Do not describe the operation as an adventure. Do not turn biological attack into spectacle. Let the absence of use become the point. The planes did not fly that mission. The fields were not seeded with anthrax. The 5 million cakes were destroyed. Sometimes history is shaped by what was prepared and then refused. That refusal deserves attention. It is easy to remember weapons that exploded. Harder to remember the ones that came close. Anthrax Island is evidence of the near miss. The island was wounded by the rehearsal for a catastrophe Europe escaped. This gives Gruinard a strange moral status. It is both victim and witness. Victim because the land was contaminated. Witness because the contamination proves the plan was real. Without the island, Operation Vegetarian might feel like paper speculation. Gruinard made it physical. A place was poisoned. Animals died. Spores persisted. Cleanup happened. Liability remained. The island anchors the counterfactual in fact. This is why the story should keep returning to place. Whenever the scale becomes too abstract, millions of cakes, continental famine, biological warfare, the narration should return to the bay. Cold water. Green slopes. A warning sign. The same object returns, a bucket of soil. A sheep grazing after cleanup. A minister removing a notice. The physical images keep the story human and credible. Top history competitors understand this instinct. Large history needs small objects. The Calusa script used shells. This story uses soil. Soil is perfect because it looks harmless. It fits in a bucket. It can sit outside a fence. It can contain a state secret. The opening and ending should both use it. At the beginning, soil proves the island remains dangerous enough to terrify Britain in 1981. At the ending, soil becomes the place where the government's liability still rests. The state built a weapon in laboratories and factories. The soil kept the final copy. This is the poetic logic of the script. 5 million cakes were burned. One island remained. The broader British public memory of the Second World War often emphasizes courage, endurance, the Blitz spirit, Dunkirk, Churchill, code breaking, and victory over fascism. These stories are important and often true. But national memory becomes propaganda when it excludes everything uncomfortable. Operation Vegetarian belongs beside the heroic memory. Not to cancel it, to complicate it. Britain defended itself against tyranny. Britain also prepared biological warfare. British scientists helped protect the nation. British scientists also poisoned an island. Churchill inspired resistance. His government also considered weapons capable of mass civilian suffering. A mature country should be able to remember all of this. History is not loyalty testing. Telling the dark chapter does not betray the people who fought Hitler. It respects them by refusing to turn their war into a fairy tale. American audiences face a similar challenge with their own wartime memory. The United States fought fascism and liberated camps. It also interned Japanese Americans, maintained segregation, firebombed cities, and used atomic weapons. Democratic victory and moral injury can coexist. That is why Gruinard has cross-Atlantic appeal. It belongs to the hidden underside of the war both audiences think they know. The topic is obscure enough to surprise, familiar enough to matter, and dark enough to hold attention without fictional invention. The story's questions should continue until the final minutes. Why did the government wait so long to clean the island? Because the problem was difficult, expensive, remote, and politically containable. Why did Dark Harvest succeed? Because it made remoteness impossible. Why was Operation Vegetarian never used? Because the war changed, the weapon was uncontrollable, and the strategic need diminished. Why does the liability remain? Because legal responsibility can outlive official closure. Why should anyone care now? Because biological risk, state secrecy, environmental cleanup, and wartime morality have not disappeared. Each answer should create the next question. That is retention. Not artificial cliffhanger. Causal curiosity. The viewer remains because the story has not finished explaining itself. Gruinard cannot be reduced to one reveal. The island is a sequence. Secret test. Dead sheep. 5 million cakes. Quarantine. BBC investigation. Dark harvest. Cleanup. All clear. Wildfire. 2026 liability. Every chapter reopens the previous one. That is why the final section must resist a simple ending. Gruinard received its official all clear. But the story is not safe. It challenges the comforting belief that democratic governments use terrible weapons only in theory, that environmental damage can always be reversed, that secrecy ends when war ends, and that liability disappears when warning signs come down. Gruinard says otherwise. The state can clean the land. It cannot clean the history. Today, Gruinard Island sits quietly in the bay. There are no permanent residents. No military teams moving sheep into position. No warning signs declaring the ground forbidden. No public ferry. No visitor center. No monument large enough to explain what happened. The island is privately owned, and access is limited by ownership, terrain, weather, and the weight of its reputation. From the mainland, it still looks like an ordinary piece of Scotland. That ordinary appearance is the final visual trick. History happened there without building ruins. No bunker has to remain. No crater has to survive. The landscape itself is the artifact. This is why an aerial image works so well near the end of the video. The viewer sees green land surrounded by blue water. The image is calm. The narration explains that this place was deliberately contaminated with a biological weapon, remained restricted for 48 years, and still appears in government financial liabilities. Beauty and danger occupy the same frame. The island does not look guilty. Land rarely does. Gruinard's story also asks what a memorial should look like. Should there be a plaque on the mainland? A museum exhibition? A permanent digital archive? A monument to the animals used in the tests? A public account of the local communities that live beside the Forbidden Island? A formal apology for the delay in cleanup? The island has been declared safe, but the history remains scattered across films, government papers, news reports, scientific studies, parliamentary debates, local memory, and popular culture. Without interpretation, visitors may know only the nickname. The island now carried its darker name. A name creates curiosity. A memorial would create responsibility. This distinction matters. Dark tourism can turn contaminated places into entertainment. People seek forbidden islands, abandoned laboratories, nuclear zones, battlefields, and disaster sites partly because danger creates excitement. Gruinard attracts that impulse. But the island should not be reduced to a dare. Landing illegally does not honor the story. Touching soil does not prove courage. Ignoring private ownership and safety advice repeats the same arrogance that made the island a test site, the belief that personal curiosity outranks the limits of place. The better approach is historical attention. Look from shore. Read the archive. Watch the wartime film. Listen to local memory. Understand the plan. Respect the land. The point is not to conquer Anthrax Island again. The point is to understand why governments thought conquering it was acceptable. The 2022 wildfire adds one last visual chapter. Fire moved across a landscape once contaminated by invisible spores. Emergency services observed the blaze from the mainland because the island is difficult to access. News reports revived the old nickname. For many viewers, the first question was not about habitat or private property. It was whether the anthrax might return. That reflex shows how strongly the old story controls the island's identity. The official all-clear had been given 32 years earlier. Yet fire still triggered biological fear. This is what long-term secrecy does to public perception. Once trust is broken, later events awaken the hidden version of the story. The fire also creates a symbolic image too powerful to ignore. In 1942, Britain used explosion and disease to turn the island into a weapon. In 2022, natural fire swept the same ground. The flames were not part of the old experiment. But they made the island look as if history were burning through the surface. No renewed outbreak followed. The island remained officially safe. The fear survived. That distinction should be stated clearly. The story is not that Gruinard is secretly lethal today. The story is that a past biological experiment created a reputation powerful enough to outlive decontamination. That reputation now protects the island in a strange way. People keep their distance. Myth does the work warning signs once did. The island's 2026 indemnity is not a dramatic emergency notice. It is a legal precaution connected to the disposal of the property and the possibility of claims. But the dry language gives the ending credibility. The British government does not need to believe the island is actively dangerous to retain an indemnity. It needs to recognize that responsibility could still arise under certain circumstances. This is how modern states live with old experiments. Not through daily panic. Through clauses. Through insurance. Through contingent liabilities. Through language designed to prepare for an event no one expects but no one is willing to price. The word unquantifiable is therefore not proof of hidden contamination. It is proof that the government cannot completely convert the past into a closed number. Some risks resist accounting. The final minute of the documentary should slow down. No more rapid reveals. No more new characters. Return to the opening. A bucket of soil outside Porton down. Imagine the worker who first saw it. It was only earth. Then a message made it suspicious. A laboratory made it dangerous. A test connected it to an island. An island connected it to a war. A war connected it to 5 million cakes. The entire story was inside the bucket before anyone opened the file. That is why the soil is the perfect object. It contains the weapon and the cleanup. The crime and the evidence. The landscape and the liability. The past and the threat of return. The story should then move backward one last time. Before the bucket, there was dark harvest. Before dark harvest, there were warning signs. Before the signs, there was the cleanup problem. Before the cleanup problem, there were dead sheep. Before the sheep, there was a bomb. Before the bomb, there was a plan. Before the plan, there was fear. Fear of invasion. Fear of hunger. Fear of Hitler. Fear that Germany would use disease first. Fear built the weapon. The weapon poisoned the island. The island outlived the fear. This is the final moral structure. Wartime fear is temporary. What fear creates can become permanent. The 5 million cakes never reached Germany. That matters. Millions of people were not exposed through the British plan. German farmland was not deliberately seeded with anthrax. Allied soldiers did not advance into the aftermath of their own biological strike. Europe escaped that future. But the rehearsal still had a victim. Gruinard. This makes the island more than a failed weapons site. It is the physical cost of a catastrophe that did not happen elsewhere. A small island paid for a continental plan. That sentence should sit near the end because it gathers the entire story into one idea. One remote island absorbed the cost of a weapon intended for a continent. The British government chose Gruinard because it seemed expendable. The island was uninhabited. The coast was remote. The danger could be isolated. The public did not need to know. The same criteria appear again and again in the history of testing. Choose somewhere distant. Choose somewhere politically weak. Choose somewhere the center can forget. Gruinard was not politically weak because people lived on it. It was politically weak because almost no one did. Absence became vulnerability. An empty island had no voters. No council. No local newspaper. No school children. No residents writing to Parliament every week. The land could not object. This is why environmental ethics must include places without large human populations. A landscape does not need voters to possess value. An uninhabited island can still have ecology, ownership, history, and a future. Treating emptiness as permission is one of the habits modern environmental law has had to challenge. Gruinard was chosen because it could not speak. The story speaks for it now. The sheep also need one final return. The first flock was brought to die. The last flock was brought to live. Between those two flocks lies nearly half a century of British history. World War. Victory. Nuclear age. Decolonization. Television. Environmental protest. Thatcherism. Scientific remediation. The same island held both groups of animals. One proved lethality. The other proved recovery. This symmetry gives the story its emotional close. The weapon worked. The cleanup worked. The time between them was the failure. 48 years. That number should land without embellishment. A wartime experiment lasting minutes closed an island for 48 years. The war itself lasted less than 6. The contamination lasted 8 times longer than the global conflict that justified it. That comparison gives viewers scale. The island was dangerous longer than many people involved in the original project remained alive. Children born during the tests reached middle age before the all-clear. Some local residents lived most of their lives beside a forbidden place created by a government secret. The plan was temporary. The quarantine became generational. This is why the story remains relevant to debates about military pollution, PFAS chemicals, nuclear waste, unexploded ordnance, abandoned bases, and environmental justice. The specific materials differ, but the pattern is recognizable. National defense creates local burdens. The strategic center benefits. The test site waits. Cleanup is delayed because it is difficult and expensive. Communities demand action. Officials promise review. Time passes. Gruinard is the clean, cinematic version of a much wider problem. An island is easy to visualize. The principle exists everywhere. The story should not end by suggesting governments learned nothing. Britain eventually cleaned the island. Scientific knowledge improved. Biological weapons are widely stigmatized and prohibited under later international agreements. Public oversight is stronger in many areas than it was during the Second World War. Historical files have been released. The wartime film can be watched. The island's liability appears in public accounts. Progress is real. But progress is not innocence. The lesson is not that Britain today is secretly planning Operation Vegetarian again. The lesson is that institutions become safer when their past is remembered honestly. Secrecy without accountability invites repetition. Memory creates friction. Friction can stop the next terrible plan before the cakes are manufactured. This is the hopeful reading of Anthrax Island. A hidden history can become public knowledge. A contaminated site can be remediated. A government can be pressured to act. An island can return to ordinary ownership. Animals can graze safely again. But hope is earned only when the harm is named. The final line should be quiet. Britain built a weapon it never used. The cakes were burned. The files were closed. The fighting in Europe eventually stopped. But the island kept the secret alive for another half-century. Then activists carried the secret back to the government in a bucket. Scientists returned. The soil was treated. The returning flock remained healthy. Officials finally removed the shoreline notices. And in 2026, somewhere inside hundreds of pages of government accounts, Gruinard Island still appears beside one word. Still impossible to price. The island looks peaceful now. The sea moves around it. The grass grows. No bomb waits there. No flock is tethered. No commandos announce another harvest. But if you stand on the Scottish coast and look across the water, the question remains. How much can one small island remember? The answer is written in the soil. 5 million cakes became ash. Anthrax Island did not.